The call came at 2047 in the morning, and I know the exact time because I've been lying awake anyway. The way I always do now that I'm past 60 and sleep doesn't come as easy as it used to. I was staring at the ceiling fan in my bedroom, watching it turn slow circles in the dark, thinking about nothing in particular. And then my phone lit up on the nightstand. I almost didn't answer. The number wasn't one I recognized. Area code I didn't know. Some town in coastal South Carolina I'd never been to. I answered. It was a nurse. And the first thing she said wasn't my daughter's name. The first thing she said was, "Sir, are you the father of a woman named Lily?" I was out of bed before she finished the sentence. I need to back up, because if I start there, with that phone call, you won't understand what any of it means. You won't understand why I did what I did later, and you won't understand why I have exactly 0 regrets about it. My daughter, Lily, is 31 years old. She has her mother's eyes, pale gray, the kind that looks silver in certain light. And she got my stubbornness, which I'll admit hasn't always served her well. She's the kind of person who decides she loves someone and then commits to that completely, without hedging, without holding anything back. I used to think that was her greatest strength. She met her husband at a charity gala in Atlanta. His name is Prescott. Was his last name, used like a first name the way wealthy Southern families do. And he came from the kind of money that doesn't need to be mentioned because everyone already knows. His father, a man I'll call Mr. Hargrove, though that's not quite the shape of the name, had built a real estate empire across 4 states during the 70s and 80s. Shopping malls, commercial developments, the kind of wealth that has its own zip code and its own attorney on retainer 24 hours a day. Lily came home from that gala glowing. I remember thinking I hadn't seen her look that way since she was a little girl who'd just gotten exactly what she wanted for Christmas. I should have paid closer attention to that thought. Prescott was handsome in a practiced way. Square jaw, good suits, the kind of firm handshake that's been rehearsed since prep school. He was polite to me at dinner, called me sir, refilled my water glass without being asked. And I liked him. God help me, I liked him. I thought my daughter found a good one. We are not a wealthy family. I spent 34 years as a high school history teacher in Macon, Georgia. I have a pension and a mortgage I'm still paying, and a truck with 200,000 miles on it that I am unreasonably attached to. I am not impressive on paper, and when Lily brought Prescott home for the first time, I watched his eyes move around my living room and take a quiet inventory of everything. The mismatched furniture, the bookshelves I built myself from pine boards, the 20-year-old television, and I saw something flicker across his face that I told myself was not what it looked like. I told myself a lot of things in those early years. They got engaged after 8 months, married 14 months after that. I walked my daughter down the aisle in a rented tuxedo, and I cried, the way fathers do. And Prescott's father stood at the front of that 2,000-person church in a suit that cost more than my truck and watched the whole thing with an expression I couldn't quite read. The marriage was good, Lily told me. Or it seemed good. They moved into a house on a private lake outside of Savannah, and she sent me photos sometimes, the garden she was planting, the kayak she'd bought, the view from their back porch at sunset. She called me every Sunday evening. She sounded happy. She was pregnant by their 2nd anniversary. She told me on a Sunday call. I put the phone down and sat in my kitchen for a full 10 minutes just feeling grateful. I was going to be a grandfather. I am 63 years old, and I had started to think it might not happen for me. And then suddenly, there it was, real and close and true. I went out back that evening and sat on my porch steps and watched the fireflies come up from the grass, and I thought, some things do go right. 3 weeks later, Prescott's father called me. Not Prescott, his father. He was cordial. He said he'd heard the news and wanted to talk, man to man, about some concerns he had. He said the words prenuptial agreement and trust fund conditions and bloodline provisions. And I held the phone and listened and felt something cold settling in my chest. He said that the Hargrove family estate had certain legal structures that complicated things. He said that Prescott's portion of the inheritance was contingent on terms I wouldn't fully understand without the right legal background. He said he was sure we could come to some arrangement that worked for everyone. I told him, very calmly, that I was a history teacher and not a lawyer, and that perhaps he should speak with Lily directly, about whatever concerns he had. He paused, and then he said, in a tone that wasn't quite polite anymore, "Mr. Callahan, it would be better if this stayed between us." I told him I didn't think it would. I never told Lily about that call. I should have. That's the thing I carry now. The knowledge that I didn't tell her. Because I didn't want to upset her. Because she was newly pregnant and happy, and I thought maybe I'd misread the whole conversation. I thought maybe I was being a suspicious old man who didn't understand how rich families work. I was not misreading anything. Prescott's parents had a yacht. Of course they did. It was moored at their estate on Hilton Head Island, and they used it for what wealthy families use yachts for, entertaining mainly. Business relationships conducted over cocktails and salt air, the kind of socializing where deals are made without anyone ever saying the word deal out loud. Lily told me about the July 4th weekend about a month before it happened. Prescott's parents were hosting a gathering on the water. Extended family, business associates, a few old friends. She was about 16 weeks along by then, just starting to show, and she was excited. She said Prescott had seemed warmer lately, more attentive, and she thought maybe the baby was bringing them closer. I drove down to see her 2 weeks before that weekend. I wanted to see her in person. Something I couldn't name had been sitting in my stomach since that phone call from Mr. Hargrove, and I needed to lay eyes on my daughter and reassure myself that I was wrong to worry. She looked beautiful. Tired in the way pregnant women get tired, but her eyes were bright and she laughed easily, and she made me stay for dinner. And we sat on their back porch and watched the lake go flat and dark as the sun went down. She talked about names she was considering. She said she thought it might be a girl. I said any grandchild of mine was going to be stubborn regardless of the gender, and she laughed and leaned her head on my shoulder, the way she used to do when she was 9 years old. When I left, I hugged her in the driveway for probably too long. She pulled back and looked at me. "Daddy," she said, "what's wrong?" "Nothing," I said. "I'm just going to miss you." That's the last memory I have of her before everything broke open. The yacht left the dock on the evening of July 3rd. 20-something guests. Open bar. A band playing somewhere below deck. The kind of party designed to make you feel like the world is soft and generous and well-ordered. I know what happened next, only from what Lily told me afterward, in pieces, over weeks, because she couldn't tell it all at once. She and Prescott had argued earlier that day. I don't know the full shape of it. She's protected me from some of the details. But it had to do with the trust fund and the pregnancy, and something his father had said to him. The argument followed them onto the boat. By midnight, most of the guests were below deck, or drunk enough not to notice the two of them standing at the stern railing, voices low and furious. His father came up from below. Lily said she saw the two of them exchange a look, Prescott and his father, the kind of look that means something has already been decided, and then before she understood what was happening, Prescott had her by the arm. She said she thought he was pulling her toward the stairs, toward the interior of the boat, away from the argument. She started to turn, and then she was in the water. 16 weeks pregnant, midsummer Atlantic, midnight. She hit something when she went in. She still doesn't know what, maybe the hull, maybe the platform at the waterline. And the impact took the breath out of her and her shoulders seized with pain, and she went under. She came up and she screamed. She screamed her husband's name. She screamed for help. She said she could see them standing at the railing, both of them, father and son, and she screamed and the boat didn't stop. The boat didn't stop. She treaded water in the dark for I don't know how long. She said she was so cold she stopped feeling her legs and she thought, "This is how it ends." She thought of me. She told me she thought of me, and I've never been able to fully process what that means, what it cost her to have been in that water in the dark and the coldness, thinking of her father who was 60 miles away asleep in his bed and didn't know. A private vessel spotted her, a couple from Beaufort, on their way back from watching fireworks. They pulled her out. They called the Coast Guard. They held her on their boat and covered her in every blanket they had and kept telling her she was okay. She was going to be okay. The Coast Guard reached her about 40 minutes after she went in. By then, the Hargrove yacht had docked and everyone had gone home. The nurse on the phone told me Lily was at a hospital in Bluffton, South Carolina. She told me she was stable. She told me I should come. She didn't tell me about the baby on the phone. I drove through the night. 4 hours, most of it on dark two-lane roads, and I can't tell you anything about that drive except that my hands didn't shake and I didn't go into the speed limit once. And I talked to Lily the whole way, even though she wasn't there to hear me. I just talked to her out loud in the dark of my truck cab, telling her I was coming, telling her to hold on, telling her I was almost there. She was in a room on the 3rd floor. They had put her in a gown, and there were bruises on her shoulder and along her collarbone that had already gone dark purple. Her lip was split. She had an IV in her arm and her hair was still damp, even though hours had passed. She looked at me when I came to the door, and she started crying. I sat on the edge of her bed and I held her, and I didn't say anything for a long time. There was nothing to say that was adequate to the moment. So I just held her. The doctor came in about 20 minutes later. A young woman, calm and careful in the way of people who have to deliver terrible things regularly. She explained that the impact and the cold and the stress had caused complications. She used words I had to ask her to repeat, and then she said, gently, clearly, the thing I had been afraid she was going to say since I walked through that door. The baby was gone. My daughter lost her child in that water. I sat there next to my daughter's hospital bed and I held her hand while she cried, and I felt something happen inside me that I don't have a precise word for. It wasn't anger, though anger was there. It was something colder and quieter than anger. It was the feeling of a door closing, the feeling of something being decided permanently at a level beneath thought. And, in my jacket pocket, my phone buzzed. I looked at it. A text message from a number I didn't recognize. Tell your daughter we're sorry about the accident. A wire transfer has been arranged. She should speak to our attorney and sign the papers. It would be better for everyone. I showed it to Lily. She read it and didn't say anything. And then she turned her face toward the window, and I put the phone back in my pocket, and I stepped out into the hallway. I stood there for a moment under the fluorescent hospital lights. And then I called my brother. I need to tell you about my brother. I've introduced him to people as my younger brother my whole life, and that phrasing always made the people I was introducing him to look surprised, because Sterling, that's his name, Sterling Callahan, does not look like anyone's younger anything. He has always had the bearing of someone who has already seen what you're about to try and is somewhat bored by the anticipation of it. Sterling is 57 years old. He spent 11 years as a federal prosecutor. For the last 14 years, he's run his own firm, and the cases he takes are the ones other attorneys look at and quietly decline. He doesn't take them for the money, though I assume the money is considerable. He takes them because he has a specific and long-standing interest in watching powerful people discover that the architecture of their lives is less solid than they believed. He picked up on the second ring. I'm listening, he said. That's how Sterling answers the phone when he knows it's serious. Not hello, just I'm listening. I told him everything. The pregnancy, the text message, the boat, the water, the baby. I stood in that hospital hallway and told my brother everything I knew, in order, without editorializing, because I learned from watching him work that the way you present facts matters. He was quiet for about 15 seconds after I finished. Send me the text, he said. It's on its way. Is Lily's phone intact? I think so. They dried it out. Don't let her delete anything. Don't let her talk to their attorney. Don't let anyone in that family contact her without you present. Understood. Another silence. Then those party guests who were on that yacht. 20-something people. Some of them saw something. Maybe. They always see something, he said. They just need the right kind of asking. He told me he'd be on the road by morning. He told me not to call Prescott. He told me not to call Mr. Hargrove. He told me not to call anybody except him. And then he said, in the quieter voice he only uses with family, how is she? She's going to be okay, I said, because that was the thing I needed to say out loud, even if I didn't entirely know yet whether it was true. She's going to be okay. Yes, Sterling said, she is. Here is what I did not know when I made that call. I did not know that two of the guests on that yacht had already privately retained their own attorneys by the time I was dialing my brother's number. Rich people are careful in ways that sometimes work against them. The moment something goes wrong, the first instinct is to protect themselves from proximity to it, and protecting yourself from proximity to something means generating records of the moment you decided to distance yourself. I did not know that the couple who pulled Lily from the water, a man named Doug and his wife Beverly from Beaufort, retired school teachers, incidentally, my own kind of people, had already given a statement to the Coast Guard and had photographs from their phone time-stamped to the minute. I did not know that a deckhand on the Hargrove yacht had been watching from the bow when Lily went into the water, that he was 23 years old and had been working for the Hargroves for 18 months and had, in those 18 months, accumulated his own reasons to be something less than loyal. Sterling found out all of these things within 72 hours. That's what he does. Not magic, methodical, patient, thorough accumulation of what's already there. He always says the evidence is almost always already there. People just don't do the work. He met with the deckhand on a Tuesday. By Thursday, he had a sworn statement. By the following Monday, he'd filed a criminal complaint with the Beaufort County Sheriff's Office and a separate federal complaint regarding the text message, which he argued successfully, as it turned out, constituted witness tampering given the timing. Prescott's attorney called Sterling on a Wednesday morning, approximately 1 week after Lily had been pulled from that water. Sterling put the call on speaker so I could hear. He let the attorney talk for about 4 minutes. The attorney made very sympathetic noises and mentioned the word settlement 6 times. He talked about Lily's well-being. He talked about privacy. He talked about how these situations were best handled quietly for everyone's sake, and that his client was prepared to be extremely generous given the extraordinary circumstances. Sterling let him finish completely. And then Sterling said, in the pleasantest voice you've ever heard, "My niece's child died in the Atlantic Ocean. I'd like you to think very carefully about the next sentence you say to me." The attorney was quiet for a moment. "We'll be in touch," Sterling said, and hung up. I won't tell you that what followed was quick. It wasn't. These things never are. And anyone who tells you that justice moves fast hasn't spent much time watching it move. It was 8 months of paperwork and depositions and court dates and phone calls and my daughter having to sit in a conference room and describe in precise detail what it felt like to be in the water. She did it. Every time she did it. My daughter is made of something harder than anything the Hargroves built their fortune on. I watched her sit across a conference table from their team of attorneys, 4 of them, expensive suits, coordinated strategy, and answer every question without flinching, without looking away, without giving them a single thing they could use to make her smaller. I have never been more proud of another human being in my life. Prescott was charged. So was his father. The criminal case against Prescott moved forward on counts that included reckless endangerment causing injury, felony assault, and because of what the deckhand saw and what the Coast Guard documented, 1 count that involved the death of an unborn child, the specific charge varying by jurisdiction, but there and serious and on the record. His father was charged separately, related to the text message and to subsequent communications Sterling's team documented between the Hargrove family attorney and 2 of the party guests, communications that strongly suggested an active effort to coordinate their accounts before speaking with law enforcement. The Hargrove family real estate empire began to encounter problems. Some of those problems were coincidental. Some of them were the natural result of what happens when a family's name appears in criminal proceedings and their business partners begin quietly reviewing their exposure. A development deal in 3 counties fell through. A bank that had long relationships with the Hargroves became noticeably less flexible about terms. Investors who had been along for the ride for decades began to discover scheduling conflicts. Sterling didn't orchestrate that. He didn't have to. He just made sure the right information was in the right places and let physics take over. The settlement offer came back in month 6. It was a number that made Lily's divorce attorney put down her coffee cup very slowly. Lily looked at me across the kitchen table, where we were sitting when her attorney read it to us over the phone. I looked at her. "Tell them no," Lily said. Her attorney paused. "Lily." "Tell them no," she said again, steadier. "I want this on the record. I want it public. I want there to be a record that exists regardless of what they pay, so that if they do this to someone else, there's already something there. Her attorney was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "Okay." Lily reached across the table and took my hand. I thought about that morning on the porch steps in Macon, the fireflies coming up from the grass, the feeling of something good arriving. I thought about how completely I had believed in that feeling, and how completely I had been wrong about what was coming. I thought about the deckhand, 23 years old, who had watched from the bow and then, when the moment came, decided to tell the truth. People surprise you, not always in the directions you expect. Prescott pled guilty in month 9, not to all counts, but to enough. His attorney spent a long time making arguments about character and context and the complicated nature of the evening, and the judge listened to all of it very patiently, and then sentenced him to 2 years in a minimum security facility plus supervised release. His father accepted a plea on the obstruction charge. The financial penalties were significant and documented and a matter of public record. The divorce was finalized on a Thursday in February. I drove up to Savannah and took Lily to dinner at a place on the river she'd been wanting to try, and we sat outside even though it was cold, and we shared a bottle of wine, and she talked about what she wanted to do next. She was thinking about going back to school. She'd always been interested in environmental law. She thought maybe there was a version of the future she could build in a different direction. She looked like herself, more like herself than she had in years, honestly. There was something settled in her face that I hadn't seen since before that marriage began. Some quality of being undefended that I recognized from when she was a young woman who hadn't yet learned that the world requires defenses. I didn't cry at dinner. I waited until I was in my truck in the parking garage, and then I sat there for about 10 minutes in the dark and let it all move through me. The months of it, the weight of it, everything I'd been holding at bay so that I could be steady for her. And then I started the truck and drove home to Macon. My brother called me when I was about an hour out, just to check in. We don't talk every week. We never have been that kind of brothers, the weekly check-in kind. But he calls when it matters. I told him about dinner. I told him she seemed like herself. He said, "Good." I said, "Sterling, thank you." He was quiet for a moment in the way he gets quiet when something means more than he wants to show. And then he said, "She's my niece." There's no version of this where I wasn't going to do everything I could. I know. I've always known that about him. When our father was sick, years ago, Sterling drove 14 hours without stopping because he'd decided that was what was needed. When I was going through my divorce, Lily's mother and I separated when Lily was in college, a story for another time. Sterling showed up on my doorstep one Saturday morning with a bag of groceries and a 12-pack and didn't say anything about it. Just put the groceries in my refrigerator and watched a football game with me for 6 hours and drove home. That's who he is. Underneath all the jurisprudence and the terrifying calm across the negotiating table, that's who he has always been. "Drive safe," he said. "Always do," I said. I'm telling this story because I think some things need to be said plainly. I'm 63 years old, and I've spent most of my adult life teaching young people about history, which means I spent most of my adult life teaching young people about power, who has it, how it gets used, what happens to people who don't have it when they come into contact with people who do. I taught that material for 34 years, and I believed it mattered, the knowing of it, the clear-eyed understanding of how these forces operate. And then it happened in my own family, and I found out that knowing about power is not the same as being prepared for what it feels like to be on the wrong side of it. Nothing prepares you for that. What I know now, what I would tell anyone who finds themselves in a version of this situation, is that the machinery these families use depends on silence. It depends on the other party being too frightened, too isolated, too exhausted, too ashamed to keep pushing. The settlement offers and the coordinated witnesses and the attorneys who call with sympathetic voices are all designed to produce silence, and they usually do, because they are very good at it and because most people don't have a Sterling. My daughter had a Sterling. She had me. She had a couple from Beaufort, who happened to be in the right place at the right time, and who were exactly the kind of people who do the right thing without needing to be asked twice. She had a 23-year-old deckhand who decided that a paycheck from a powerful family was not worth the weight of what he'd seen. Justice, when it comes, usually comes because of accumulation. Small acts of courage from ordinary people who decided not to look away. I believe that. I've always believed it, and I believe it more now than I did before, which is not a thing I expected to be able to say after everything that happened. My daughter started law school in the fall. The first Sunday after classes began, she called me at the usual time, 7 in the evening, and she talked for 40 minutes about property law and civil procedure and a professor she already loved, and she was laughing by the end of the call. Really laughing. The way she used to laugh before that marriage put something cautious into her. And I sat in my kitchen and listened and thought, there it is. There's the thing I've been waiting for. Some things do go right. Sometimes you have to fight like hell to get there. But some things do go right. I keep coming back to the couple from Beaufort, Doug and Beverly. 2 retired school teachers on a boat, coming home from watching fireworks, who saw something in the water and didn't look away. They didn't calculate the risk. They didn't wonder whether it was their business. They just pulled my daughter out of the Atlantic and covered her in blankets and held her until help came. I think about them more than I think about Prescott. I think about them more than I think about his father, or their attorneys, or any of it, because what they did is the thing that made everything else possible. There's a version of this story where Lily doesn't survive, where Doug and Beverly sail past, or arrive 10 minutes later, or decide it's too dark and too complicated. That version exists. It was very close, and the only thing that separates the story I live from that one is 2 ordinary people who made a choice to do right by a stranger. I've thought a lot about why things ended the way they did, not in a cosmic sense. I'm too old and too practical for explanations that tidy, but in the plain human sense of cause and effect, of choices compounding over time until they become outcomes. Prescott and his father made choices that night on that yacht. Small ones before the big one. The choice to prioritize a trust fund over a human life. The choice to believe that money creates a kind of impunity, that the rules that govern ordinary people don't apply at a certain altitude of wealth. Those choices didn't begin on that boat. They were built over years, probably decades, probably generations, and they ended in a federal criminal filing and a sentence and a real estate empire that has spent the last year quietly contracting. I'm not saying they got everything they deserved. I'm not sure the legal system is capable of delivering that. What I'm saying is that the architecture they believed in, the one built on the assumption that power is permanent and consequences are for other people, turned out to be less solid than they'd been told. My daughter sat across from 4 attorneys in a conference room and answered every question without flinching. That took something. It took the kind of inner steadiness that doesn't come from circumstances. It comes from knowing who you are at the bottom of things, knowing that your sense of yourself is not contingent on what someone else does to you. Lily had that. She had it before the marriage, and she had it after. And no amount of money and no amount of cruelty was able to take it from her. That is not a small thing. That is, honestly, the thing I'm most proud of. Sterling did what Sterling does. Methodical, patient, thorough, devastating. He followed the evidence where it led, and he didn't cut corners, and he didn't get emotional about it. There is a kind of intelligence that isn't about raw intellect. It's about knowing which questions to ask and having the discipline to keep asking them even when the answers are slow in coming. Sterling has always had that. It's why the right people hire him and the wrong people fear him. What I know now, standing on the other side of all of it, is that none of this worked because of any single heroic moment. It worked because enough people, a deckhand, a retired couple, my brother, my daughter, her attorney, each made the choice at their individual moment to do the harder right thing instead of the easier wrong one. Those choices accumulated, and accumulation, in my experience, is how most things of consequence actually happen. Lily starts her 2nd year of law school in the fall. She called me last Sunday at 7, same as always. She was laughing about something her professor said. I sat in my kitchen and listened and thought, there it is. That's what it looks like when someone survives something and comes out the other side still whole. That's what it looks like when the right things hold.